Hello everyone, how are you today? Let's learn psychology again. Let's talk about social and personality development in adolescence. Adolescence is the age from 12 years old to 20 years old. Self-concept and self-esteem. The broader view of themselves is one aspect of adolescents' increasing understanding of who they are. They can see various aspects of the self simultaneously, and the view of the self becomes more organized and coherent. They look at the self from a psychological perspective, viewing traits not as a concrete entity but as abstractions. Teenagers are more likely than younger children to describe themselves in terms of their ideology, saying something like, I am an environmentalist. Then, in terms of physical characteristics, such as, I'm the fastest runner in my class. By the end of adolescence, however, teenagers find it easier to accept that different situations elicit different behaviors and feelings. Sometimes they may be concerned when their behavior is consistent with the view. However, now they understand. It depends on certain circumstances and situations. Self-esteem. Asking, how do I like myself? Adolescents differentiate various aspects of the self, also leads them to evaluate those aspects in different ways. For example, an adolescent may have high self-esteem in terms of academic performance, but lower self-esteem in terms of relationships with others. Gender differences in self-esteem. During adolescence, girls' self-esteem tends to be lower and more vulnerable than boys' self-esteem. One reason for this difference is that, compared to boys, girls tend to be more concerned about physical appearance and social success, in addition to academic achievement. Although boys are also concerned about these things, their attitudes are often more casual. Additionally, societal messages suggesting that female academic achievement is a roadblock to social success can put girls in a difficult bind. If they do well academically, they jeopardize their social success. That sounds a bit weird. I had a discussion with this with one of the lecturers actually in class. Although generally self-esteem is higher in adolescent boys than girls, boys do have vulnerabilities of their own. For example, society's stereotypical gender expectations may lead boys to feel that they should be confident, tough, and fearless all the time. Boys facing difficulties such as not making a sports team or rejection from a girl they wanted to date are likely to feel not only miserable, but about the defeat that they face, but also incompetent because they don't measure up to the stereotype. Socioeconomic status and race differences in self-esteem. Race and ethnicity also play a role in self-esteem, but their impact has lessened as prejudicial treatment of minorities has eased. Early studies say that minority status would lead to lower self-esteem. This was initially supported by research. African Americans and Hispanics had lower self-esteem than Caucasians because prejudicial attitudes in society made them feel disliked and rejected. This feeling was incorporated into their self-concepts. However, more recent research gives a different result. Most findings suggest that African American adolescents differ little from whites in their levels of self-esteem. One explanation is that social movements within the African Americans community that bolster racial pride help support African Americans adolescents. A stronger sense of racial identity is related to a higher level of self-esteem in African Americans and Hispanics. Another reason for overall similarity in self-esteem levels between adolescents of different racial groups is that teenagers generally focus their preferences and priorities on those aspects of their lives which they excel. Self-esteem may be influenced not by race alone, but by a complex combination of factors. For example, race and gender simultaneously, coining the term ethnic and gender, to refer to the joint influence of race and gender. One study that simultaneously took both race and gender into account found that African American and Hispanic males had the highest levels of self-esteem, while Asian and Native American females had the lowest levels. Identity formation, change or crisis. According to Erickson, adolescents strive to discover their particular strengths and weaknesses and the roles they can best play in their future lives. This discovery process often involves trying on different roles or choices to see if they fit an adolescent's capabilities and views about himself or herself. Through this process, they seek to understand who they are by narrowing and making choices about their personal, occupational, sexual, and political commitments. This is called the identity versus identity confusion stage. Basically, in adolescence, according to Erickson, it is the stage where people try to find their identity. Adolescents who stumble in their efforts to find a suitable identity may go off course in several ways. They may adopt socially unacceptable roles as a way of expressing what they do not want to be. Or they may have difficulty forming and maintaining long-lasting, close personal relationships. Generally, their sense of self becomes diffuse, failing to organize around a central, unified core identity. On the other hand, those who are successful in forging an appropriate identity set a course that provides a foundation for future psychosocial development. They learn that their unique capabilities and believe in them. And they develop an accurate sense of who they are. They are ready to set out on a path that takes full advantage of what their unique strengths permit them to do. Societal pressures and reliance on friends and peers. Adolescents feel pressure to decide if their post-high school plans include work or college, and if they choose work, which occupational track to follow. During this period, adolescents increasingly rely on their friends and peers as sources of information. At the same time, their dependence on adults decline. This increasing dependence on the peer group enables them to forge close relationships. Comparing themselves to others helps them clarify their own identities. This reliance on peers to help adolescents define their identities and learn to form relationships is the link between the stage of psychosocial development and the next stage Erikson proposed, known as intimacy versus isolation, which is early adulthood stage. It also relates to the subject of gender differences in identity formation. When Erikson developed his theory, he suggested that males and females move through the identity versus identity confusion period differently. He argued that males are more likely to proceed through the social development stages in the order they are shown in this table in the textbook. Developing a stable identity before committing to an intimate relationship with another person. Females reverse the order, seeking intimate relationships and then defining their identities through these relationships. These ideas largely reflect the social conditions at the time Erikson was writing, when women were less likely to go to college or establish their own careers, and instead often married early. Today, however, the experiences of boys and girls seem relatively similar during the identity versus identity confusion period. Psychological moratorium. The psychological moratorium is a period during which adolescents take time off from the upcoming responsibilities of adulthood and explore various roles and possibilities. Psychological moratorium. It means the adolescents take time off from their responsibilities, take a pause. For example, many college students take a semester or year off to travel, work, or find some other way to examine their priorities. On the other hand, many adolescents cannot, for practical reasons, pursue a psychological moratorium involving a relatively leisurely exploration of various identities. Some of them, for economic reasons, must work part-time after school and then take jobs immediately after graduation from high school. As a result, they have little time to experiment with identities and engage in psychological moratorium. The satisfaction that can come from successfully holding a part-time job while attending school may be a sufficient psychological reward to outweigh the inability to try out various roles. Marcia's approach to identity development. Using Erikson's theory as a springboard, psychologist James Marcia suggests that identity can be seen in terms of which of two characteristics, crisis or commitment, is present or absent. Crisis is a period of identity development in which an adolescent consciously chooses between various alternatives and makes decisions. Commitment is psychological investment in a course of action or an ideology. We can see the difference between an adolescent who careens from one activity to another with nothing lasting more than a few weeks, compared with one who becomes totally absorbed in volunteer work at a homeless shelter, for example. Marcia proposed 4 categories of adolescent identity. I think the category is very interesting. Let's hear about it. The categories are identity achievement, identity foreclosure, moratorium, and identity diffusion. The first one, identity achievement. The status of adolescents who commit to a particular identity following a period of crisis during which they consider various alternatives. Teenagers within this identity status have successfully explored and thought through who they are and what they want to do. Following a period of crisis during which they considered various alternatives, those adolescents have committed to a particular identity. Teens who have reached this identity status tend to be the most psychologically healthy, higher in achievement, motivation, and moral reasoning than adolescents of any other status. The second one, identity foreclosure. The status of adolescents who prematurely commit to an identity without adequately exploring alternatives. These are adolescents who have committed to identity, but who did not do it by passing through a period of crisis in which they explored alternatives. Instead, they accepted others' decisions about what was best for them. Typical adolescents in this category are a son who enters the family business because it is expected of him, and a daughter who decides to become a physician simply because her mother is one. Although foreclosures are not necessarily unhappy, they tend to have what can be called rigid strength. Happy and self-satisfied, they also have a high need for social approval and tend to be authoritarian. The third one, moratorium. The status of adolescents who may have explored various identity alternatives to some degree, but have not yet committed themselves. Although adolescents in the moratorium category have explored various alternatives to some degree, they have not yet committed themselves. As a consequence, they show relatively high anxiety and experience psychological conflict. On the other hand, they are often lively and appealing, seeking intimacy with others. Adolescents of this status typically settle on identity, but only after something of a struggle. Moratorium means they have explored various identities, but they haven't decided one yet. Or they finally can settle on identity, but after a struggle. The fourth one, identity diffusion. The status of adolescents who consider various identity alternatives but never commit to one or never even consider identity options in any conscious way. Adolescents in this category neither explore nor commit to considering various alternatives. They tend to be flighty, shifting from one thing to the next. While they may seem to be carefree, their lack of commitment impairs their ability to form close relationships. In fact, they are often socially withdrawn. It's important to note that adolescents are not necessarily stuck in one of the four categories. Some move back and forth between moratorium and identity achievement in what has been called MAMA cycle. MAMA, MAMA cycle. Moratorium, identity achievement, moratorium, identity achievement, MAMA. For example, even though a forecloser may have settled on a career path during early adolescence with little active decision making, he or she may reassess the choice later and move into another category. For some individuals, then, identity formation may take place beyond the period of adolescence. However, identity gels in the late teens and early 20s for most people. Religion and spirituality. Adolescents may question their religious identity. After having accepted their religious identity in the childhood, they may view religion more critically and seek to distance themselves from former religion. They may be drawn more closely to their religious affiliation because it offers answers to such abstract questions as, why am I here on earth? And what is the meaning of life? Our understanding and practice of faith and spirituality proceeds through a series of stages that extend throughout the lifetime. As they leave adolescence, people typically move into the individuative reflective stage of faith, in which they reflect on their beliefs and values. They understand that their views are one of many and that multiple views of God are possible. The final stage of faith development is the conjunctive stage, in which individuals develop a broad, inclusive view of religion and all humanity. They see humanity as a whole, and they may work to promote a common good. In this stage, they may move beyond formal religion and hold a unified view of people across the globe. Identity, race, and ethnicity. Cultural assimilation model. Individual cultural identities are assimilated unified culture of US. Based on a traditional cultural assimilation model, individual cultural identities should be assimilated into a unified culture in the US. The proverbial melting pot model. This textbook is written by a US author. That's why there are so many examples about the situations in US here. The pluralistic society model, US society made up of co-equal cultural groups. The pluralistic society model suggests that US society is made up of diverse co-equal cultural groups that should preserve their individual cultural features. The pluralistic society model grew in part from the belief that the cultural assimilation model denigrates the cultural heritage of minorities, and lowers their self-esteem. From this perspective, identity development includes development of racial and ethnic identity. The sense of membership in a racial or ethnic group and the feelings that are associated with that membership. That's what it means with the identity development. The development of racial and ethnic identity. There is a middle ground. Minority group members can form a bicultural identity in which they draw from their own cultural identity while integrating themselves into the dominant culture. This view suggests that individuals can live as a member of two cultures with two cultural identities without having to choose one over the other. Adolescent depression. Long-term depression, biological factors are often involved. Although some adolescents seem to be genetically predisposed to experience depression, environmental and social factors relating to the extraordinary changes in the social lives of adolescents are also important influences. There is little evidence that is linked to hormone differences or a particular gene. Instead, some psychologists speculate that stress is more pronounced for girls than for boys in adolescence due to the many, sometimes conflicting demands of the traditional female gender role. For instance, female adolescents worry not only about doing well in school, but also about being popular. Girls' generally higher levels of depression during adolescence may also reflect gender differences in ways of coping with stress rather than gender differences in mood. Girls may be more apt than boys to react to stress by turning inward, thereby experiencing a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. On the contrary, boys more often react by externalizing the stress and acting more impulsively or aggressively, or by turning to drugs and alcohol. Adolescent suicide. The most obvious explanation is that the stress experienced by teenagers has increased, leading those who are most vulnerable to be more likely to commit suicide. One factor is depression. In addition, social inhibition, perfectionism, and a high level of stress and anxiety are related to a greater risk of suicide. Okay, so those two things, the depression and suicide, are the two things that are quite popular or quite common in adolescent stage. In addition to depression, some cases of suicide are associated with family conflicts and relationship or school difficulties. Many schools have established crisis interventions team to counsel students when a student commits suicide. Several warning signs should be sound an alarm regarding the possibility of suicide, including writing a will, loss of appetite, and other things. Relationships. The quest for autonomy. Autonomy is the independence and a sense of control over one's life. Adolescents increasingly seek for more autonomy. Independence and sense of control over their lives. To them, their parents' refusal indicates a lack of trust or confidence. In most families, teenagers' autonomy grows gradually over the course of adolescence. Increasing autonomy led them to perceive parents less in idealist terms and more as persons in their own right. For example, rather than seeing their parents as authoritarian disciplinarians, mindlessly reminding them to do their homework, they may come to they see their parents emphasize on excelling in school as evidence of parental regrets about their own lack of education and wish to see their children have more options in life. At the same time, they come to depend more on themselves and to feel more like separate individuals. By the end of adolescence, power and influence have become more balanced. Parents and children end up in a more symmetrical or egalitarian relationship. Power and influence are shared, although parents typically retain the upper hand. Culture and autonomy. Cultural factors play an important role as well. In Western societies, which tend to value individualism, adolescents seek autonomy at a relatively early stage of adolescence. On the contrary, Asian societies are collectivistic. They promote the idea that the well-being of the group is more important than that of the individual. Adolescents in more collectivistic cultures tend to feel a greater obligation to their families in terms of fulfilling their expectations about their duty to provide assistance, show respect, and support their families in the future. In collectivistic societies, the push for autonomy is less strong, and the timetable during which autonomy is expected to develop is slower. The more important factor is the degree of match between cultural expectations and developmental patterns. What probably matters most is how well the development of autonomy matches societal expectations, not the specific timetable of autonomy. Gender also plays a role. Male adolescents are permitted more autonomy at an earlier stage than female adolescents. The encouragement of male autonomy is consistent with more traditional male stereotypes, in which males are perceived as more independent and females, conversely, as more dependent on others. This is a very old view, I think. The more parents hold traditional stereotypical views of gender, the less likely they are to encourage their daughters' autonomy.